Outdoor adventures around every corner in South Dakota. Hike through the otherworldly maze of rock formations in Badlands National Park. Boat, fish, kayak, or paddle in rivers and lakes. Wind through majestic mountain spires on a scenic drive down Needles Highway. Roam Custer State Park with herds of bison, bighorn, sheep, and elk. When you're ready to get out and road trip again, go great places. Learn more at travelsouthdakota.com. Anyone can be ready to go back to school, but with Staples Connect, you can be more than ready. Like, I got everything for my classroom and saved a ton ready. They've got more backpacks, more pens, and more supplies than you ever thought possible. So double knot your shoes and gas up the minivan. Staples has everything you need and more for the new school year. Just visit your nearest Staples store or go to staplesconnect.com for inspiration. This on? Hello? Hello?
We're all science people.
Science!
Exactly. Evolution does some pretty funky things.
That is a false fact.
The old question in science is, how do you know that?
Achievement equals skill times effort.
That's the recipe for success.
I'm about to show you something so cool it'll blow your mind.
We can make the world better for everybody.
Starting now.
Welcome to Science Rules. I'm your host, Bill Nye. This is the show where science rules. It's a call-in show. If you want to be on the show, and I hope you do, leave us a voicemail at 201-472-0785 or go to askbillnye.com. You can also check me out on all the social media that the kids use to find out about our upcoming guests. But today, I'm joined once again by science writer, editor, and seriously, everybody, dear friend, Corey S. Powell. Hello, Corey.
Bill. Greetings. Always good to be here. Always fun to be here. Bill, what is my favorite joke of yours?
Okay. My old boss. Everybody has worked for somebody that you thought was an idiot. So my old boss jokes, Corey, that's how I roll.
Yep.
Why do you bring that
I
up?
love your old boss jokes. And when I think about your old boss, I picture him, as a simple man. Often the jokes sort of present him almost as as a caveman or a Neanderthal type. And, with today's episode, I'm starting to wonder, is that unfair? Are we not being compassionate enough? And I don't mean about your old boss, who clearly is a horrible, horrible person, but to the poor Neanderthals.
Well, it wasn't horrible. He just sucked as a boss.
Exactly. He was probably not the sharpest tool in the shed. So maybe we're being unfair to the Neanderthals. I mean, we talk about them as if they were like, oh, they're dumb brutes. They just died out because we smarter humans came along and stole their lunch or whatever. But I know there's a lot more to the story. And I want to hear today from a Neanderthal advocate, or at least an expert, who can help set us straight. Bill, what can you do? What can you do for me?
Corey, you're in the right place here on Broadcast Podcast. Yes, our guest today is Dr. Rebecca Ragg Sykes. She is an archaeologist and author of the book Kindred, Neanderthal Life, Love, Death, and Art. Dr. Rebecca Ragg Sykes, welcome to Science Rules. Do I call you Rebecca?
Yeah, that's good. And thank you so much for having me.
Oh, no, it is we who must thank you. Okay, before we get started, I grew up in the U.S. I have an American accent and all that. Is it Neanderthal or Neanderthal?
I am in the Tal camp because it's named after the Neanderthal, which Tal is German for valley. So I go with Tal.
And Neander is, we have the word new. My name's Nia. I think is that the New Valley?
It's the Valley of the New Man, which you could not have a more serendipitous place for the first sort of recognized other sort of human to have been found.
So the valley is not named after the remains.
No.
The remains are named after the valley, which just serendipitously happens to be named the Valley of the New Man.
Yeah, it's named after a composer called Joachim Neander, who actually came from a family that changed their name from Neumann, but it means the same thing, new man. So yeah, it's absolutely amazing.
So I feel kindred with the Neanderthals because my name is New, roughly New and Danish. All right. How many of us had sex with Neanderthals?
Okay, let's start with the important bit.
You knew the question was going to come up sooner or later, so let's just,
Well,
let's just
everybody's
get it
talking
right
about
out of the
that
way.
we are part Neanderthal. The Neanderthal tribes interacted. Can we say interacted with the Sapiens
it's a nice
tribes?
euphemism.
What's the story?
Okay,
Did
well,
we have sex with Neanderthals?
we absolutely did. Why would people want to know about Neanderthals? Well, because they're awesome and cool. They are A-list hominins, and yes, we have known for a decade now that we certainly did interact, have admixture with Neanderthals, make babies with Neanderthals. That actually was quite big news because for quite a long time, one of the major theories in human evolution was that Homo sapiens, so that's our species, our population, dispersed out of Africa and basically replaced the Neanderthals. And the question was, well, how? Was there interaction, or did we just kind of arrive after they'd already gone? But this ancient DNA research, which really sort of kicked off a decade ago, showed clearly that there had been interbreeding. And we now know, 10 years on, that happened multiple times through over 200,000 years probably. So the whole story of who met who, when, and what happened has got a lot more complicated.
Where do I go to get Neanderthal DNA?
Bones and teeth, but in fact, we can actually amazingly get it from sediments now. Absolutely mad. But that is now happening, science fiction level stuff. But yeah, where do you go? Ideally, not somewhere hot or moist. You really need somewhere that is cold and dry so that the DNA doesn't degrade. So some of the highest coverage samples that we have come from Siberia, for example, from caves which are cold, all year round.
Okay, so we're Neanderthals cave guys and gals.
They spent time in caves, not like we don't believe that they ever lived deep in cave systems, although they did visit them. But they weren't sort of just hanging out in caves. They also spent a lot of their lives in the open landscape. And they were hunters and gatherers, so their lives were very mobile. We think probably that they didn't really spend more than a few weeks at a time at any place, but they revisited them.
So the caves were kind of an opportunistic shelter?
I think they were known spots in the landscape. I think when they were being used, we can see in sites which have really high resolution archaeological records where you basically have layers that build up nice and slowly with lots of sediment, so lots of different occupations don't get mixed and splurged together. When you can pick out those different occupations and date that nicely, you can see Neanderthals are there for a few centuries. They come in, but they're coming back, they're coming back, sometimes seasonally. You can see that from the different measures in the animal teeth that they're hunting, and then they're gone again for 1,000 years. So during the times when they visit caves, it does look as if it's like a regular part of the territory that they're within.
So when you talk about Siberia and they came back and there was 1,000-year gap between one residency and another, how long ago was all this going on? Neanderthaling arounding Siberia?
Just Neanderthaling around. The time span that we're talking about for Neanderthals is that we can see them emerging as a distinctive population, basically in terms of their bodies, their anatomy, somewhere around 350,000 years ago. They're already beginning to be genetically distinct, sort of by 430-ish. That's kind of proto-Neanderthals. And then through that next 50,000 years, they really become distinctive. And then they are around in Eurasia until 40,000 years ago. So that's actually an enormous span of time. And that covers multiple phases of climate change as well.
Right. And then how long during that period were they overlapping with modern humans, with anatomically modern humans?
Well, that's actually one of the things that's changed a lot recently. As I was saying earlier, there were these ideas that maybe we dispersed out of Africa and then replaced them. And that was all believed to happen quite late, sort of maybe somewhere between 50 and 40,000 years ago, when we see the last Neanderthal stuff and then they just disappear from the record. You don't see their bones or their archaeology anymore. But what has changed now is that, as well as knowing that we did interbreed, we have found remains of early Homo sapiens people in Eurasia a lot earlier than we used to believe. So now we can see, for example, there are remains in the Near East, in Israel, probably 180,000 years ago. That's way older. And off over into Asia, at least by 50,000, but it's got to be before that, really, because we can see what we believe is Homo sapiens people in Australia by 60 to 65,000 years ago. So that span of time over which we were dispersing out of Africa, going into Eurasia, and potentially having contact with Neanderthals is much, much bigger. And that fits with what we see from that DNA, which tells us that the interbreeding itself was going on over this huge span of time.
So I'd love paint a picture of that world for us. There's a period of something, maybe even 100,000 years, when there are two different human species hanging out and interacting with each other. They're the Neanderthals and these anatomically modern humans. What's going on?
The other thing I want to know, as you describe this world, how many people, it wasn't millions, how many people were crossing paths?
Yeah, certainly not millions. We don't think at any point in time there were more than 20,000 Neanderthals in existence, possibly less. And I would say it's likely the same for Homo sapiens outside Africa.
And so these tribes were wandering around Eurasia interacting.
Well, yeah, and it's not just Neanderthals and us. That's the other thing, is that it is actually more than two. If you look over Eurasia and Africa, then there are at least sort of 6 different kinds of hominins around at that point. And it's only actually the last 40, 50,000 years when it's just been shrinking. And then by 40,000 years, as far as we know, it's just us.
But what was the world like then?
It depends on when do you mean? Because over that whole span of time they're around, you're talking about multiple periods of massive climate change. So what we call glacial, so cold ice age type conditions that people are going to be associating with mammoths and things like this. And then you also have warmer periods, what we call interglacial. So we are in an interglacial right now. And in fact, they also experienced at least one period when it was even warmer than today. So this is a forest world. You also sort of, I say, well, when were they living in order to talk about their environment, but also where? Listeners might think Neanderthals, they're like super European. They're not really. If you look at the geographic span of where we find their sites, there's actually more of them, more coverage in Asia. The Asian record is not as well known, but they certainly can't be called a European species. And in that whole range, from where I am in Wales, right across down into the Mediterranean, into Palestine and Israel, up into Central Asia and into Siberia, that's an enormous range of different kinds of landscapes. And we know that they were living on the coasts. They were doing rock pooling, basically. They were living in grassland, mountains. And as I just said, during these warm periods, they were living in full-on forested environments alongside, tropical-like creatures like hippos up in Yorkshire in England.
There's only 20,000 of these people.
Yeah, but hunter-gatherers in general, depending on the environment they're in, they can live at really low densities across the landscape. If you live in a really rich environment, like a tropical jungle where you have abundant fruit and the animals all around you, it's easier to live, in slightly higher local numbers. Whereas if you look at, classic hunter-gathering peoples from the Arctic areas, there's virtually nobody around when you look at the density across the landscape, but they are using the entire landscape. So that is going to vary according to where the Neanderthals are and the climate.
When you talk about using the whole landscape to forage for food and so on?
Yeah. We don't actually know the real extent of Neanderthal territories. It's quite complicated to work that out. One of the best ways that we have is by essentially looking at the kind of stone that we find in one site and then tracing the geological sources of that and saying, okay, well, some of this red flint comes from 50 kilometers to the northwest.
You're talking about stone that they used for tools?
Yeah, exactly, for their stone tool technology. And some of the black chert comes from 300 kilometers to the south. So that's at least giving you some kind of scale. But the question is, you can't actually use that as like a boundary and just draw a simple line around that site, because those objects were probably carried over sort of trips between different places before they arrived there. So we don't think Neanderthals like lived at one place and then went out to quarry stuff and came back. It's a little bit more complicated.
Okay, so I'm still trying to get a picture of these interactions. You have these 20,000-ish Homo sapiens and 20,000-ish Neanderthals operating over this very large territory over a very long period of time. The evidence you were talking about before of interbreeding, you were talking about genetic evidence, but what do we know of, like, how they were interacting? Do we know anything of what their relationships were like? Or did they live together? Did they live together? Or did they just kind of like date casually?
Interact casually.
Yeah. Those are some of the most hotly contested things in the whole of like Neanderthal research, basically. So
Which side of it are you on?
Well, I mean, clearly they did meet. They were having babies, and we can tell from the genetics that during the later periods of interbreeding, which is the source of the material for the genetic legacy in living people, that later interbreeding was probably between Neanderthal men and Homo sapiens women. So those babies, the hybrid babies, would have been probably raised within Homo sapiens groups. But we know that it goes the other way as well, because it looks as if some of the Neanderthals' Y chromosome, so that's the male sex chromosome, or some, or perhaps even all of it, was actually from Homo sapiens interactions before 200,000 years ago. So those had to be babies, male babies, that were raised in Neanderthal populations. So what's going on changes through time, clearly. But also, like I said, we should assume that there's going to be diversity. We don't know what the social contexts were for this. And I think there's been a tendency to assume for quite a long time that it was all based in conflict, because we like to think that we're great and special and awesome and we replaced the Neanderthals because we were, a better version of humanity or whatever. And therefore that there would be conflict. That we would come in and, push them out, and maybe some fighting, whatever. And as part of that, perhaps interactions, sex was coercive. But actually, there's no archaeological evidence that says that. It could have been the other way round, where you're talking about curiosity, encounters that are, one-offs, lucky encounters, and people just, just get together by the fire, but we just don't know. That's the thing.
Stick around for more science rules after this.
KiwiCo creates super cool, accessible, hands-on projects designed to expose kids of all ages to concepts in STEAM: science, technology, engineering, art, and math, Corey.
Yes, KiwiCo believes in the power of kids, and that small lessons today can mean big, world-changing ideas tomorrow. Crates are designed by experts, tested by kids, and they teach new STEAM concepts.
Each box is delivered monthly and comes with all the supplies needed for that month's project, plus detailed kid-friendly instructions and an enriching magazine filled with content to learn more about that crate's theme.
The different lines cater to different age groups, and there are a variety of topics. Plus, the crate includes everything you need, so you don't have to worry about running out for extra supplies.
You know what's the best way to start spring break when you're a kid? That's right, getting a package in the mail that's just for you, Corey.
Yes. And parents like me love having projects to supplement online schooling by providing hands-on learning opportunities.
Hands-on, Corey, that's the key. Discover engaging science and art projects for kids of all ages. You too. Learn the science behind hydraulics. Build a walking robot. See how high you can make a rocket fly. Everything you need to make STEAM seriously fun, delivered to your doorstep. Get 30% off your first month plus free shipping on any crate line with code SCIENCERULES. That's 30% off your first month at KIWICO, KiwiCo.com, promo code SCIENCERULES.
Science Rules is back.
What about their anatomy? I've read many times in different sources that if we saw a Neanderthal gal walking down the street, he might look not that different from a U.S. football player. But you wouldn't really notice him if he were dressed or she were dressed the way modern people dress. So what about, the classic stereotype, what about their eyebrows, their forehead and all that?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about Neanderthals, a lot of people like to say, oh, I know one, it's my wife's cousin, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's very close to the old boss.
Yeah, exactly. First off, there was no knuckle dragging. They were absolutely as upright walking as us, I mean, depending on how much the average person is into human evolution, it's quite easy to get the wrong idea about Neanderthals as some kind of like missing link between us and like super ancient ape relations like 4 million years ago. But really, Neanderthals are far more similar to us than to any sort of idea of chimpanzees or anything like that.
So are there any would there have been noticeable differences?
Right. So if you had a nice shaved, showered, dressed Neanderthal walking down the street, would you take a glance and say there's something different about that person?
Yeah, you would say that's a striking face. Essentially they on average are a bit shorter. They are stockier. They don't have, their ribs are more flaring, so they have larger chests, and also their ribs don't sort of tuck in like ours do, so they don't have a little waist, they look more like a barrel-shaped chest. But overall, the proportions are very similar, but yes, it's the face, I think, would be really striking. So they do have brow ridges, and that's actually accentuated because they don't have what we have. I mean, we are kind of like the weirdos in the hominin group because we have these really massive balloon heads. We also have quite flat, tucked in little faces that are really sort of tucked underneath our brows compared to most other hominins, but it's the big head, and so that means our foreheads are actually quite straight, quite vertical, whereas Neanderthals' heads were sort of, they look a bit more like an aerodynamic sort of shape. They're kind of like sloped back a bit, but also their faces are quite pulled forwards. So from the nose and like the chin, it kind of looks a bit more snouty without sort of trying to imply something animal. Like they just had super impressive noses. The front of the face is pulled forward slightly, and you can see even the impact of that because there's a little gap behind their back tooth. The wisdom teeth that lots of people get pulled out, there's a little gap behind there, and that's because the whole of the front of their face has grown forward. So on our faces, we have bone absorbing cells. That's why ours are kind of shrunken underneath our faces, our brows, whereas theirs had a lot more bone growth cells. So that's where the difference comes from.
Did they have longer arms? Would they have?
The overall proportions are quite similar, but what we can see sort of aside from how they grew, and it's interesting that even the newborn babies show these features, but at the same time, part of the reason that they are probably sort of quite stout and the bones are thick is because they had really intensive lifestyles, enormous amounts of walking and running around the landscape, but also loads of just really physical stuff with their arms. So we can see like the development of muscles in some cases on like their dominant arm, because most of them are right-handed like us, is of the level that you see in like professional sports players, tennis players and things. So what that actually was, some of it might be, you might assume, oh, it's spear throwing, whatever, but some of it's probably from working skins, really repetitive, maybe even from napping, making the stone tools. So there's really
flaking off stone tools, napping,
yeah, really intense activity.
Now, how do you know they're right-handed?
Oh, well, that's really interesting. You can see it in part from some of the stone cores, the sequence of flakes that were taken off. That shows you the direction that the core was being turned. And also, we can see when they ate things, what we believe is that they did what we can see in some recent and historic populations of humans, where you put meat or some other food in your mouth, you hold it, and then you slice it off in front of your mouth with a stone tool, and you have your teeth. And sometimes you get a little scratch
your
there.
Teeth, your teeth.
Well, no, this is more delicate because you don't want to chop your lips off. So as the direction of your piece of stone, your flake, chops off that meat, you get tiny, tiny scratches on the front of your teeth, only the front teeth, and they go diagonally. And it's that direction that shows you the handedness of the person. And it's basically, it looks to be about 90% right-handed, which is exactly like us.
What about their state of mind? I mean, everything you're describing is physiological, but what do we know about, did they think like we did? Did they have language like we did? I mean, you mentioned the words love and art in the title of your book. What do we know, or what can we know about how a Neanderthal thought or how a Neanderthal acted?
Well, I think one of the really exciting things is that alongside genetics, a lot of people understand that ancient genetics has really shifted our view about Neanderthals and our understanding, but actually just archaeology itself as a discipline has matured hugely over the past sort of 30 years or so. We now understand a lot better than we did 30, 40 years ago that you can't just sort of dig up and keep the nice bits. You actually have to dig really nice and slowly, pay attention to your sediments so you know the layers, and also keep all the little bits, because it turns out even all the dross that comes off a core of rock that you're trying to make a tool from, all the stuff that people regard as waste, actually that can be really informative about how that technology works.
So were they making art? What were they doing?
Okay, well, no, look, I'm saying it because it's important. You have to start with what people regard as boring, which is, the stone tools. But actually, what we see in the stone tools is that they had a massively systematic mind. They were really flexible, and they completely understood the material properties of what they worked with. So stone, wood, they were actually really good carpenters. They used other things for tools like bone and shell. So these are all things that have been claimed were like stuff that made us super special and kept us sort of separate from them. Turns out they actually could do an awful lot of that too. And then when you look at the other stuff, like the more sexy art stuff, that people want to hear about, although using the word art is tricky because it conjures up really specific things in our minds, like people think of galleries and art on the wall. That's not what we're talking about. But what we can say for Neanderthals is that there seems to be like an aesthetic interest in materials. So that's in unusual objects like fossils or geodes, but also in using mineral pigments, so natural colour, and applying that to surfaces, and also making incisions on things, so cutting repeated lines into stuff that's nothing to do with butchery. And because we've understood as archaeologists, we have to be really careful how we dig our sites. We have to pay attention to everything. Now we can see this stuff because we're looking for it, and we are being a lot more, careful in the way that we actually analyze and go back to old collections as well. This is happening. People sort of shoved stuff in museums 60 years ago, and people have gone back and gone, oh, look, there's more.
So what changed? The DNA, I mean, I understand sequencing technology emerged, but what changed about the discipline of looking at a site where you found artifacts or something significant?
Well, we record everything in 3D with lasers in our sites now. As well as that, you have a massive range of archaeological science that has completely blossomed. So if you have a stone tool, for example, we can geologically source that using chemical analysis if we have to a particular place. If you can also look for residues on that tool of the kind of things that it was used to cut. You can look for distinctive polishes, which tell you the same thing. This is all based on experimental samples that we have. If you find a skull, you can look at you've got an entire range of stuff you can do to look at the anatomy and measure, the heck out of it. But you can also look for DNA, obviously. You can scan like the teeth and look for the growth lines, which every couple of days, so you can actually assess how quickly Neanderthals developed as children. Staying on the teeth, you can look at isotopes, and if you have a milk tooth from a child, you can see when they were weaned. Did they encounter any really serious illnesses when they were young? We can see that too sometimes because there's sort of interruptions in the growth. Then you can look at like the dental calculus in between the teeth, the grot that your hygienist removes. In that, we can find tiny preserved bits of starches, and some of those we can tell how they were cooked. And you can also look for DNA in that too. So like anything that you find in a site now, there is just the most astonishing range of techniques that we have to pull out that information.
What does a site look like?
It depends. If you have a cave, caves are really good for being places that preserve stuff, because, most of the time they're not subject to erosion, unlike open air sites. So in a cave, depending on the kind of chemistry you have a good chance at having bones there. Depending on the different soils, you might have nice fine kind of wind-blown sediment that comes in, or you might have what we call breccia, where there's the cave earths have then become cemented by calcium deposits, and that's really hard to dig that stuff out. But if you look at open air sites, then we can see, for example, that we have butchery sites and kill sites, and those are preserved in different ways. And there's even a site in France where it looks as if Neanderthals were basically camped out near a river, and then after they left, there was just a flood in the river, and it deposited loads and loads of very fine silt very quickly over that site, which means that it was preserved really well, including an arrangement of what appeared to be post holes in a ring about 10 meters across, and that, we believe, is actually an outside structure. Basically, it's an outside camp, which had some kind of sort of barrier, maybe made of posts and skins, and inside there you can see preserved the different areas where they were sitting and working their flint. There's a hearth. There's an area at the back which had loads of rotted plant stuff, which possibly was a bedding area. So if we have sites with exceptional preservation, what we can say about how they actually lived is amazing.
I'll say. Now, how did you get into this? My family, we are fond of jigsaw puzzles. Is that your kind of thing? Solving puzzles?
I do actually like jigsaws, yeah.
Were you an obsessive kid? Were you a kid who
No,
you wanted to understand how the world works, you were looking for clues?
I was one of those kids that likes, nature and likes collecting stuff when they're out on walks and things. So my pockets would be full of little bits of shell and stones and twigs and stuff like that. But I was also, I guess, always drawn to the past. I do remember digging up my garden. I grew up in London, and I have distinct memories of trying to dig that up, and I still have a pot shard that I found there. So I started off on urban archaeology and then went back in time. But I guess I have a calling to try and understand how people's past experiences were, and that includes Neanderthals.
So, people are obsessed with whodunit style stories, and kids, as a science educator, I can tell you, kids are fascinated with forensics. With what happened at the scene of the crime. Was that your kind of thing?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's interesting because with Neanderthals, you have sort of the investigative thing of, what's going on in a particular site, and you can have that at different scales. Like, with one object, what does that object mean? Where did it come from? How is it used? What can it tell us? And then you have the whole layer it came from, and then you have the whole site, and then you join those sites up across the landscape. So you have these different scales of what we can say, and it is all kind of a detective story. There's an amazing site in Spain. I write about it a lot in the book, called Abric Romani, which has fascinating archaeology because it has really unusual preservation where calcium deposits formed over this site every time the water table rose. And so basically you have incredible preserved layers of how Neanderthals lived there. All the spatial stuff is there, like where the hearths were, where the piles of animal stuff was. And like you can see amazing stuff there. Like you can look at the micro layers in the hearths and see that they were burned at different temperatures over different periods. And at the back of the cave there, the hearths were arranged about 1 meter away from the wall. And that matches what we see in a lot of ethnographic sites, because that's basically where people sleep, right against the wall. And those hearths at the back of the cave look to have been like smouldering hearths. They weren't high temperature blazing things. They're like night hearths. And so you start to envision, people lying down on the skins at night by these smouldering embers, and that's real existence. So it's very hard to not kind of try and envision that.
Okay, I have to ask a question, because this was a paper that I came across last week, and I'm sure you've seen it, about the Neanderthal poop.
Yes.
50,000-year-old Neanderthal poop, which I believe was on one of these hearths. you could tell from the chemistry that it had not been heated. So it was like after the fire had gone out, a Neanderthal had defecated on the hearth. What's going on there? Do you know about this? Do you have an interpretation of this?
Yeah, that's from El Salt. This is another Spanish site, which I have in the book a lot because, the hearths there are amazing. They have really good preservation. You can tell the different species of wood that they were burning and things like this. But with the feces evidence, it is really interesting. And, if it would fit what we see from other kinds of evidence that Neanderthals were not sort of just, slapdash in anything that they did, whether it was making tools or spears or keeping their living spaces clean. We can see that they cleaned the hearths out and dumped that material in basically like midden deposits, like rubbish dumps. And so if they are cleaning up the site at the end and then putting the fires out with waste, well, that's basically waste management. And we can see that at different places.
Oh, really? Okay. So here's the fundamental big question when I think about Neanderthals or cave people of any sort. How did we end up apparently on top? What's different about our face, our balloon heads, our snouts? What happened with that sapiens ended up running the show, at least for now?
Well, everything we see about Neanderthals, like I've said, they were very, very successful, living hunter-gatherer lifestyles for an awfully long time.
300,000 years or something.
Yeah, and over most of that time, our early Homo sapiens ancestors were also around doing their own thing. And most of the time, the archaeology doesn't look very different. It's only really after about 100,000 years ago that you see differences that are beginning to be more striking. There are some differences in some of the stone tool technologies, like in South Africa, you start to see heat treatment of rock, for example, to basically make it more predictable in how you work it. But then there's like the more symbolically interesting things, like the fact that although Neanderthals are also interested in pigments and colours and making lines on things, it appears that the early Homo sapiens people around 80,000 years ago really started getting into that as well. And in South Africa, again, there's a site called Blombos where we have engravings on not only pieces of red pigment, so red ochre, but also on ostrich eggshell. And they are more formal than anything we see done by Neanderthals. So they are like lines and cross hashes within like a little frame of other lines that they put around it. So it's really formalized. And Neanderthals did make repeated sequences of lines on things, but we don't see this graphic thing emerging so far. So there does seem to be a difference there. And you can kind of take this out into other aspects of sort of interest in shells and things like that. So there's just more of it. And it's like hyped up in us, what they're doing.
Art was part of sapiens life, perhaps more than it was Neanderthal life?
I think something is going on that's different. I think that the traditions, the aesthetic traditions are more formalized, and that's probably to do with being linked somehow to extended social networks and social identity. So the reason that we think that is because, I mean, it just makes sense, like symbolic objects allow you to have a commonly understood culture and language that links many groups. So there was this idea for a long time that maybe that's what made us, more resilient as a population. And in fact, the genetics again do actually suggest that, because although there was never a lot of Neanderthals and there was never a lot of early Homo sapiens in Eurasia, what we see in the few cases that we actually have of DNA from early Homo sapiens people is that they appear to be coming from a more interlinked population. So Neanderthals, everybody was living in tiny groups day to day, moving around an awful lot, but the Neanderthals appear to be quite isolated. So they might have had a few family groups over, a region, many, many valleys, but that was it. Whereas,
how big was a family group?
Oh,
small groups?
Probably, I mean, we have to guess based on the numbers of hearths that we see in high resolution layers. and then match that with what we see in hunter-gatherer ethnography and things. But basically, we don't think that they lived in groups bigger than sort of 20 individuals, and they probably separated off into little subgroups to go off on hunting trips and things. And like we can see in some places, there's like a layer and it's literally one hearth and a few tools, and so, a couple of people probably stayed there for a night.
So what gave sapiens the advantage is that we had cross-tribal, cross-hearth interactions.
Yeah.
Is it because our tool making was a little finer, our brains were a little bigger?
I think the social networks is actually really key, because if everybody's living, very spread out across the landscape, then something that goes wrong, your herds don't arrive, that can be a really big problem for you as a hunter-gatherer, whether you're a Neanderthal or not. But if you know that 200 kilometers away, 300 kilometers away in another river system, there are people who will recognize you, and you can go over there and have access to their resources. That could be the difference between making it and not. And if Neanderthals did not have that, it's kind of like a social insurance. If they didn't have that, then that could be the end of that local population.
Is there any reason to think that our size and shape, our anatomy, gave us this advantage, this ability to interact and have cross-cultural or cross-valley communication?
Well, that's really interesting because it links obviously to language.
I was going to ask about that, is what we know about language.
Yeah, and when we make fun of cave people, we grunt.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's fair to Neanderthals at all. The latest view of their anatomy is that they probably could make roughly the same range of sounds as us. Some of the vowels may be a bit different, but sort of their control of air in their lungs is not necessarily worse.
This is just based on anatomical studies of what you
can... this is just anatomical, because we actually have the bones that support your voice box, and they're called hyoid. We have one of those for Neanderthals, and once you factor in the different sort of shape of the neck and all of that, you can model it really nicely, basically, and it comes out pretty much the same. So they don't have the handicaps that chimpanzees do, that they just can't make a lot of the sounds we can.
Well, I'll just say to the chimpanzee, careful what you wish for. When you can make all these sounds, it doesn't mean you communicate any better.
Next thing you know, they're making podcasts. Yeah. That's
right. Yeah. Was there any evidence of Neanderthal podcasts?
No.
But speaking of their technology, there's a stereotype of the cave guy in the bearskin. If they're in Eurasia at different times, they must have ways to keep warm and their hearths for sleeping and stuff. What did they wear? What were their tools? How did they roll? They have sewing machines? What happened?
No, it's not the Flintstones. What we believe is based on a lot of evidence, actually, that comes down to the way that animal bones are being cut. We can see the cut marks and the placement on how those bodies were taken apart. We know they're skinning things. And we can see from particular polishes on stone tools that they were working skins to get all the fresh, meat and membranes off. But sometimes we can also see tools where they're working dried skins, basically, hides that have been stored. But there is a really interesting new find from a French site, which is a really tiny piece of what appears to be like a 3-ply piece of twine. So a little tiny, it's only like 6 millimeters long, very, very fine. And it's 3 little pieces that are twisted one way and then all 3 twisted together the opposite way, exactly like, the stuff that you would have in a scarf or whatever. And that has been made from some kind of conifer tree, possibly the bark or the roots. So that is very much like...
it's ancient rayon.
Well, yeah, it's exactly like
from wood products.
It would be similar to what we see in a lot of indigenous North American cultures, where they do use spruce roots and things like this, and you can strip it down and get the fibers out. So that's just one piece, and it was preserved on a piece of on a stone flake where there was like a natural mineral film over it. And the same sites had fish scales and rabbit hair and things like this. So it's a really amazing site. It does link to a German find where there's another stone tool with a little brown organic scrap on it that turned out to be full of oak tannins. And oak tannin is a perfect thing for tanning leather. So, you get all these tiny little unique finds, but when you start to piece the picture together overall, You get this view that Neanderthals knew a lot about plants as materials as well. So maybe they did use plant textile.
Science Rules will be right back. You're listening to Science Rules.
Is there evidence of things being assembled? Let me see. How would I describe this?
Yes, composite technology.
Yeah, that's what I meant, Corey.
Yes.
Composite technology.
Yes, there definitely is. And this comes back to the plant knowledge, actually, because we know that Neanderthals were putting things together because we can find the glue that they did it with, so the adhesives. We can see on some flakes some kind of like polish that might be to do with bindings, like string, which probably plant fiber. But on other things, we can see residues from adhesive substances. One is really well known, which is birch tar. And that's super interesting because you have to actually cook that out of birch bark. You have to have it in a fire. You can't let the fire get too hot or it just chars. And it distills out into like this gloopy black stuff. And it's an extremely good adhesive for multi-part objects, basically. So they knew how to do that. We've got finds going back over 200,000 years in Italy, then later in Germany, about 80,000, and from the bottom of the North Sea, because of course at various points that was land that they were walking around on, and there's a find from there which is about 55,000 years ago. So that seems to be a technology that's quite widespread through time. I don't know if it's, whether that's like a persistent culture or if it was reinvented many times, we don't know. But that's not the only one. There's also a new find from Italy which shows that they were actually making a recipe for this adhesive. And instead of birch tar, they're using pine resin, but mixing it with beeswax. And so pine
that old trick. You've been there, Corey.
You knew that, yeah.
But you've made reference to hearths and recipes. Did they have cooking pots or did they have eating utensils? How would we know that?
There is no evidence at all that Neanderthals had any kind of ceramic technology, so like pots made from clay. That appears much, much later. So the oldest evidence for that's like 20,000 years ago from Asia. So a long time after Neanderthals. But, we do think, aside from sort of just roasting joints on a fire, there's one piece of evidence that they did use, that they did boil things, which comes, like I mentioned earlier, from looking at the dental calculus. There is a tiny sort of some starch grains from in between the teeth of a Neanderthal, which appear to have been heated. So, we have big experimental collections where we try all this out and then we can see what it looks like under the microscope. And if you look at the stuff from this dental calculus, it looks like starch grains that have been boiled rather than like dry, parched or heated next to a fire or something like that. So that is one tiny little piece of evidence. How would they do it? Well, you can actually use the insides of skulls. That's one way. There's lots of indigenous cultures that will cook inside boxes. Birch boxes, actually, birch tar. But also you can actually cook inside animal skins over a fire or stomachs, as long as the level of the liquid inside it stays higher than the flames and it won't burn.
So here's the thing. Nowadays, and by that I mean even a century ago, when the going got tough, looking for protein, modern humans, end up eating each other. Did Neanderthals, were they cannibals?
You're thinking a little Donner Party there?
Well, is one of the myths, or is it a myth about Neanderthals that they would resort to cannibalism when they needed to?
Well, it's not a myth that there are sites where we see consumption of bodies. But what might be a myth is why they did that. So, we tend to assume that because we're in a Western society and the way that you treat the dead is really specific, you do not eat them, basically. That is not the only opinion on what eating a person means. And if you look at other cultures, it can be something very different. It can have social meanings, and it doesn't necessarily imply those things. So in the sites where we see it for Neanderthals, First of all, like, there is a whole debate about, did they bury their bodies in a way that looks a lot more like what Western ideas about burials should look like, a whole body in the ground. That's been debated an awful long time, and it does look now with modern cases and modern reanalysis that they did sometimes do that. But alongside that, we have increasing evidence that they also sometimes took bodies apart, so butchered them very thoroughly, and sometimes consumed them. And also, quite often, there's no clear indication that they were necessarily actually starving. There are animals in the sites. They don't look necessarily less healthy than other Neanderthals. So there's no reason to believe it has to be about that. Personally, I think that if we look, for example, at how our closest relations, chimpanzees and bonobos, they also sometimes will consume bodies, but in them it seems to be linked to emotional reactions. And there's definite evidence, for example, that chimpanzee bonobo females will carry the bodies around of their babies who have died for days, sometimes for weeks. And that's being quite well understood now as a reaction to basically the trauma of that change in the baby being alive, and then it's not, and they can't let go of that, and they don't know how to process that. But also, when an adult dies, as well, you see the same thing. If it's a sudden death, the group gathers around and they are intensely focused on the body. Initially, they try and see, if it's actually going to come back to life or if it's just ill or whatever. But then after that, they start to do other things. They start to touch it and pull it and groom it even. And there's one really amazing case where, because chimpanzees do use natural toothpicks to clean their teeth out, where the friend of one of these chimps that had died was seen to try and clean their teeth out. And so, for me at least, I don't think it's that much of a stretch. If we imagine that what Neanderthals did all the time with the bodies of the animals they ate was they took them apart with their stone tools. So if you have the body of a loved one and you're all gathered around, well, maybe it's not so weird to behave as you normally behave and you take it apart. And it's our ideas that eating something is some kind of awful thing to happen, but perhaps it made sense to them and it was just part of a grieving process.
I mean, all this discussion of bodies is making me wonder, what would happen if you found, say, an intact mummified Neanderthal or an ice mummy, like Ötzi the Iceman? What kinds of questions could you answer that you haven't been able to answer so far? Because it would seem to me that could be utterly transformative.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and Ötzi, this Copper Age person, listeners probably remember that was from the Alps when that was found, this body up on a glacier.
Oh man, it's just so cool. I guess literally cool.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
he had a violent death apparently.
Well, yeah, but I mean, that got me into sort of archaeology. I was quite young when that came out. It was absolutely fascinating. And if we found a Neanderthal, I mean, it would come from probably Siberia, thanks to climate change. There's a lot of melting permafrost and there are animals coming out. People have seen in the news, there's wolves, things like this, even cave lion cub recently. And those are species which are quite rare in caves. So there's no reason why we might not find a Neanderthal. But if we did, I think two things would be absolutely mind-blowing. One would be to actually see their faces, because we've spent 160 years imagining what they really looked like, and we can do amazing reconstructions and stuff, and CSI with their skulls and all this, but actually seeing their face would be incredible. But as an archaeologist, I would want to know, what did they have on them? What was their everyday gear? What did they use to carry stuff in? We don't even know what their bags looked like. They had to have had some kind of bag.
What kind of hats? Did they have cool
yeah,
hats?
did they have hoods? I don't know. All of it. So, and that's the thing about Ötzi. He did have a bag. He had stuff, and we saw that he carried around fungi and stuff, which has been interpreted as a little medical kit for himself. So all of those things that we didn't even expect to see, there would be those kind of things for Neanderthals. There would be unknown unknowns that we can't even imagine.
It's been speculated. Okay, now we have the internet. Now we get 16 emails a day. Now we have Twitter. We have things. We have Instagram. We got all this stuff. We got TikTok. We have this, and this all the stuff. This all this input all the time. This coming into you. Got to process.
Bill, you're okay. You're okay.
I'm fine.
You're okay. You're okay. Okay, you're good.
Go back to 50,000 years. You'll be fine.
So it's been speculated that Neanderthals and their contemporaries had free time, probably before crossword puzzles, but that they would have time to themselves. And boy, those were the good old days when you were just hunting, gathering, scavenging, tanning a hide with a stone tool. Those were the days, really. Is that true, or were they just as anxious and nutty as the rest of us?
I think in general, most hunter-gatherers do have a reasonable amount of leisure time, but it does depend on the kind of environment you live in. If you live in a really rich environment and you're surrounded by food, it's easy to kind of chill because you can just go and pick some nice nuts. But if you live, in northern latitudes on the steppe, you might have quite a hard life. And, at the end of your day when you've been out finding food and stuff, well, you got to start working the skins to replace your children's clothes or whatever, or you got to go out and get some more wood. So I think it's going to be variable, but I do think probably there were some times when people would be chilling out by the fire in the evening and looking up at the stars, maybe.
Why did the Neanderthals go out of business? Why did they disappear? What's the deal?
Well, this is the $1 million question, isn't it? And, some people are like, oh, in your book, you didn't tell us why. And it's like, well, we don't know. Climate might have been part of it. This period after 50,000 years ago until about 40,000 years ago, it was definitely getting colder, but it was also really quite unpredictable. There could be really significant changes in climate over one person's lifetime. So you would expect herds that used to be there are gone. So that could make a difference. But on the other hand, they had actually been through things like that before. So it wasn't novel for them as a species. People used to say, well, clearly it was us because we turn up 40,000
Right.
and then they're gone. But now we know that's not the case. We know that actually Homo sapiens were in Eurasia for an enormously long time before that. And it appears that we didn't get into Europe until very close to the end. So why is that? Why were the
End of the Neanderthals.
Yeah, so we were like in the Near East, we were off in Asia, up in Siberia, but not in Europe. So were they keeping us out? Actually, is that pointing to them being successful? So it does seem that something changed after that time that meant that we became more successful and they went. Although there's interbreeding very, very late, we can see that there's a jaw from Romania, Homo sapiens man, who had a Neanderthal ancestor around 200 years before he lived, only around 40,000 years ago. So that's right at the end. There's still interbreeding happening.
So what did those last days of the Neanderthal look like? Was there a place of a last stand? Were they isolated populations? Was there one guy who was like, oh my God, I'm the last Neanderthal?
Technically, there had to be one last one, but I don't think we can sort of say necessarily, oh, the last Neanderthals were in Spain or something. I think it's going to be more piecemeal than that. I think they're going to be lots of little shrinking territories all over the place. So it's going to be quite a long process. But technology might be part of it as well.
If there are only 20,000 of you, with respect,
it doesn't take much, yeah.
stuff could happen unexpectedly. Things could happen in multiple locations unexpectedly, and over the course of a couple centuries, there'd be trouble. Corey!
I hear something, and that's not a sound produced by a Neanderthal. It sounds like thunder. Oh, I get it. It's the lightning round.
It's the lightning round. What is the coolest object you found in your field research?
Pieces of stuff that Neanderthals were making very close to when they went extinct from a site in France.
What, a piece of what stuff?
A stone, sorry.
A stone. Oh, cool.
Pieces of stone in the animal bones, yeah.
What is the biggest thing we don't know about Neanderthals?
Ooh, I'd like to know more about what they did with plants. There's so many little hints, and we're just getting tiny windows into that.
All right. Is there a popular movie? Is there a popular movie that comes close to depicting Neanderthals accurately?
No, but there is a really good book that people might want to check out by Claire Cameron called The Last Neanderthal, which is a great novel.
Oh, I thought it would be Kindred Neanderthal Life, Love, Death, and Art.
That's not a novel. That's your
even
science,
if it reads like one, page turner.
Well, that's true. I do have the little introductory bits at the chapters, don't I? Yeah.
All right. So hang on. Is there a bad movie?
Kind of most of them.
If you were not doing archaeology, what would you do?
I've managed to combine my two passions, so I'm writing now. So that's what I'd probably do, or maybe art.
If you could pick Do you want to live your life as a sapiens or as a Neanderthal?
As a sapiens.
Why is that?
Oh my gosh, because just health reasons, you'd probably die. Whether you were a sapiens or a Neanderthal 50,000 years ago, your chances would not be awesome.
Okay, but what if it were 50,000 years ago? Which would you choose?
Oh, I think it would be equal. I think I'd like to try both.
That's a politic answer right there. This is cool.
We're not going to lose even a single Neanderthal listener with that answer.
This has just been great. Our guest today has been archaeologist Rebecca Ragg Sykes. Her book is Kindred Neanderthal Life, Love, Death, and Art. We learned that we pronounce it Neanderthal. Remember, when it comes to understanding our long-lost relatives, Corey, science rules. Now, if you like Science Rules, please take a moment to rate and review it on Apple Podcasts and on Stitcher. It helps us out, helps other people learn about the show, helps us know what you want to hear about. So thank you. Be sure to look at my socials for more information on our upcoming guests. I'm at Bill Nye on all those things. Meanwhile, if you'd like to leave us a voicemail, give us a call at 201-472-0785 or submit a question to askbillnye.com. Science Rules is produced by Harry Huggins and Corey S. Powell, the very same guy. Hey, Casey Halford mixed this episode and composed our original theme. Josephine Margarana is our executive producer, and at Stitcher, Science Rules.
Stitcher.